The Tablighi Jamaat is a transnational Islamic piety movement that has experienced dramatic growth in the past few decades in Pakistan. Tablighis insist that Muslims have abandoned religion, deen, and have been seduced by the world, dunya, which has resulted in moral, political, and economic decay. A state Tablighis refer to as moral chaos, fitna, a term that also means temptation. Tablighis insist that Muslims must be brought back to Islam through a distinct form of face-to-face preaching, da'wat, which involves traveling in groups of men and preaching the virtues of Islamic practice to fellow Muslims. Dawat, Tablighis say, is not only for the person to whom it is directed, but crucially is the sacred means for realizing pious virtue for the Tablighi himself. However, Tablighis recognize that achieving piety, that is, cultivating piety, requires more than simply preaching to others. It also requires companionship, sobat, in the congregation with other pious Muslims, which is seen as molding piety into proper shape. In other words, dawat is a means for pious cultivation, but this pious cultivation depends on its realization on developing relationships with other pious Muslims in the congregation. Okay? In this paper, I argue that the Foucauldian notion of ethical self-cultivation that has framed prominent studies of Islamic piety has ignored or at least downplayed the fact that piety is a relational form and an intersubjective achievement. Piety in the Foucauldian framework comes to appear like a product of an individual acting on him or herself through ritualized practices. This ignores the limits of individual agency and the conditions of ritual efficacy, which I argue require forging relationships beyond the sphere of religion and specifically requires connecting religious and family life. In this paper, I argue that while Tablighis understand piety to be a product of relationships developed in the congregation, what Tablighis call certain faith, yaqeen, the ultimate aim of the congregation requires creating disciplinary forms developed in the mosque, particularly the ritualized reading, ta'lim at home. So things that are both in the mosque and in the home, linking the mosque and the home under the voiced presence of God. When this is achieved, the Tablighi acquires certain faith, but when he fails, his faith becomes precarious. Okay? So doubt is really what the theme that I want to focus on here. The Tablighi Jamaat is a transnational piety movement that began in the 1920s in North India, but now has a major presence in many parts of the world, especially where there are large South Asian populations. Pakistan is one of the 4 major centers of Tablighi activities, along with India, Bangladesh, and England, with hundreds of thousands of Muslims from Pakistan and around the world attending the annual congregation in Raiwind, as well as other congregations in cities across the country. Since the 1980s, the Tablighi Jamaat has grown dramatically in Pakistan, as evidenced by the large mosque complexes that have sprung up in all major cities in the country. These mosque complexes serve as key institutional nodes in a network of mosques that are informally affiliated with the movement. The Tablighi Jamaat falls squarely in the Deobandi tradition of Islamic reform that grew to prominence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in South Asia, centered at the Darul Uloom Seminary at Deoband in North India. The Deobandi school advocates a return to the authentic Islam as it is manifest in the Quran, understood as the word of God, the prophetic tradition, Sunnat, as documented in the Hadith literature, and the Islamic legal canon, the Shariat, as outlined by the reformist ulama of the Deoband tradition. The principal goal of the Deobandi ulama was to reform, the word islah, or to correct Muslim practices of illicit innovations, bid'at, and bring them back to the original Islam of the Quran and prophetic tradition. So in the 19th century, there were these strong reform movements, early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th centuries, out of which this school, the Deobandi tradition emerges, and the Tablighi Jamaat is a product of that. Tablighis insist that their method of preaching, Tariqa-e-Tabligh, follows the Prophet's example, and therefore, like all of the Prophet's actions, is divinely inspired. It is only this form of preaching, they insist, that is efficacious in spreading Islamic virtues and capable of communicating God's will and command. Dressed in traditional shalwar kameez, an Islamic cap, and sporting long flowing beards as per prophetic example, Tablighis can be seen walking through Pakistan's villages, towns, and cities, preaching the merits of Islamic practice, inviting, which is the literal word of the meaning of the word dawat, fellow Muslims to the mosque to listen to sermons and discuss religion, and encouraging Muslims to join them in giving dawat to others. Tablighis say that dawat is the duty of every individual Muslim as per the Quran, quote, And let there be arising a nation from you, inviting all that is good, enjoining what is right, and forbidding what is wrong. And those will be the successful. From the Quran. Tabligis interpret this and other passages to mean that it is their duty to preach to fellow Muslims who have abandoned religion and been led astray by the world. The central claim of the Tablighi movement is that giving dawat to others grows one's own faith, solidifies certainty, and creates the passion and desire to fulfill one's religious duties. Dawat, Tablighis insist, is first and foremost for one's own reform or correction, and only secondarily for the reform of others. I was repeatedly told that by giving dawat on the virtues of a specific practice produced or gave birth to faith, I was repeatedly told that by giving dawat on the virtues of a specific practice produced or gave birth to the desire for that specific practice. While all Islamic practices cultivate the inner affective dispositions that propel one to live an Islamic life, dawat, they would say, is the mother of practices, al-amal, because it gives birth to faith and connects oneself to God's self. Apni zaat ko Allah ki zaat se jod deta hai. Okay. It therefore disciplines the animalistic passions located in the lower self, the nafs, and draws one towards one's spirit, the part of the self that enables one to follow God's command. Dawat is then what Birgit Meir has called a sensational form, a sacred means for mediating a relationship with transcendental power, and it is through this relationship that the Tablighi acquires Islamic virtue. As a ritual, the Dawat has three felicity conditions, three conditions that it requires that have to be met in order for it to count as a ritual, right? First, Dawat must be conducted in a face-to-face, or as Tablighis say, heart-to-heart manner. Tablighis draw on a broader Islamic tradition of what Brinkley Messick has called recitational logocentrism, in which the human voice is seen as unmediated and direct, and the most reliable means for conveying the truth. Second, Tablighis say that dawat requires sacrifice, qurbani, in three forms: life force, jaan, wealth, mal, and time, waqt. The more sacrifice that a person makes in dawat, the more he elicits God's power to create transformation in both himself and others. Third, and crucially, dawat, they say, is a collective practice in ijtimai amal, rather than just an individual practice, which means it draws its force from being conducted in and through the congregation. In practice, this means that Tablighis travel and live together in mosques in order to directly preach the virtues of Islamic practice to fellow Muslims. Okay. So what I want to focus on is a bit of a ritual failure, right? Why does this work for some people and why does it not work for them, right? The idea is that it's a sort of the ideology I would call it, doing is becoming. By doing, you become the pious person you claim to be, right? But so one of the questions I explore in my work is why it doesn't always work. What is the basis of this failure? So Usman and I had met on a preaching tour that I accompanied a group of Tablighis from Karachi to Multan, and from there to the National Congregation of the Tablighi Jamaat in Raiwan. Usman was a jocular young man in his late 20s who sold cars. He was also a very capable cricketer who had briefly played in the club cricket circuit, which is a level below national cricket, and he knew many Pakistan's national cricketers as friends. To differentiate him from many other, Usman's the name of the Prophet's companion and third caliph of Islam. Sorry, I have a mistake here. He was referred to as Usman cricketer. Besides being a capable cricketer, Usman was also remarkably adept tablighi. He drew on a wide repertoire of Islamic textual sources, including a few Persian couplets, in order to establish his rhetorical authority in dawat. He evoked sharp contrast between religion and the world, painting the image of a corrupted and fallen world that had to be redeemed by infusing it with the spirit of Islam. Moreover, he was charming and funny and immediately drew people to him, especially young people. Yet for all this light-natured fun that Usman had brought to the congregation, he would frequently descend into deep solitude that was marked by a seriousness that one could not, so much so that one could not help worry about him. For hours, Usman would commit himself to reading and recitation of Quran, in which he would not speak to anyone. Usman would walk around solemnly without any hint of humor or laughter and with a sense of what appeared to be despair. In one of these bouts, Usman approached me and said with contrition, "You know, Arsalan, I only make these jokes so time passes quickly and to make things easier on myself and on others." Every night I pray and ask Allah to give me more faith so I can spend my time in practice, but it is difficult. On another occasion, Usman explained to me that faith is fickle. One minute it is here, he said, raising his hands above his head, and the other minute it is way down here, reaching for the floor. Indeed, I had come to see that Usman, for all his charisma and all his ability to draw others to Islam, was racked by self-doubt about the state of his own interior self. Other Tabligis described Usman's bouts of seriousness as becoming dried out, khushk basically. The implications of which is that something dried out is brittle and breaks easily, much like Usman's faith. But why? Usman seemed to fulfill all the felicity conditions of Dawat. He had conducted a 4-month tour that allows one to become an old companion, a designation that confers the ability also to be the leader of a traveling group. He regularly attended the Thursday night congregations, committed time to his own mosque, and was a regular at the spiritual house of a prominent Tablighi elder. In many ways, Usman was a model Tablighi, and yet his faith felt always to be on the brink of breaking down, precarious. So rather than being idiosyncratic, Usman's deep anxieties, his lack of certainty and self-doubt was a recurring theme in Tablighi life. It indexed the precarious nature of divine presence in everyday life. And while divine presence is difficult for all Tablighis to secure, not all were equally afflicted by this condition. In other words, although Usman seemed to be fulfilling the conditions for the efficacy of Dawat, there were aspects of his social existence beyond the space of the congregation that seemed an obstacle to his securing certain faith. Tablighis recognize that regardless of how committed a Tablighi is to Dawat and mosque activities, he does not spend all his time among Tablighis. He also lives in a world suffused with un-Islamic practices, and these un-Islamic practices constantly threaten the faith that he cultivates in Dawat. What happens when he cannot escape these spaces of un-Islamic practice, when he finds himself ensnared by the world? The Tablighi Jamaat is a space in which one learns how to live piously, but there are also other spaces that bear on the question of piety, the question of faith, and the question of spiritual presence, most notably the environment of the home. This is why it is crucial not only to attend the daily reading circles, the talim in the mosque, but also to establish them in the home. In performing them, one creates a spiritual home. Tablighis, I found, were perpetually concerned about the fate of kin, particularly their brothers and fathers, and I saw them frequently consulting pious authorities in the congregation on how to bring their brothers and fathers to the congregation and how to get them to participate in the daily talim at home. Kinship is central to the Tablighi conception of moral order. They insist that the moral dissolution of the home is the surest sign of moral chaos. Without fail, when one asks Tablighis to give examples of the corruption of the world, they refer to the degeneration of kin relationships. Parents are not fulfilling the needs of their children, brothers fight with one another over property, husbands divorce wives over minor infractions, wives have no regard for their husbands' needs, children abandon their elderly parents, and so on. As one Tablighi asked rhetorically, quote, "When there is no peace inside the home, how can there be calm in the world outside?" In one sermon, a Tablighi elder Hazrat explained that there are only few sins for which one is punished in this life rather than in the next. These include dishonoring the Prophet, bothering a pious helper of Allah, and disrespecting one's parents. Quote, "One should not even say uff to one's parents," Hazrat explained, voicing the sound one makes when one is frustrated and dissatisfied. When parents ask you to do something, you should consider this a gift from Allah. In this statement, the Prophet, those close to Allah, and parents occupy similar structural positions as objects of respect and veneration, just as one should occupy a position as a pious listener in relation to the Prophet, and one should assiduously listen to and meet the needs of one's parents. Under ideal circumstances, a father, son, or brother make their way into the Tablighi congregation through a process of contagion spread by one of the family members. Yet Dawat often requires creates great strain in one's family, with a person regularly having to battle with those closest to them to stay inside the Tablighi congregation. This experience weighed heavily on many Tablighis I encountered. Usman is a prime example. Usman's family was Brelvi, a large Sunni denomination organized around, among other things, the veneration of Sufi saints, something that Tablighis largely reject as a form of idolatry. This idolatry is a recurring feature of Tablighi discourse. It's a problem that has to be solved. Usman never discussed his family's opposition to his participation in the Jamaat, but others told me that his family was dehati, a term that literally means rural, but also carries the connotations of being simpletons who are easily manipulated by false religious leaders. The contrast between being spiritually grounded urban Pakistan and a rural religiosity understood as idol worship was a common theme in Tablighi discourse. So rural people had corrupted as forms of Islam was the idea. So it became clear to me that Osman's bouts of seriousness always followed some sectarian encounter with the world of Brelvis. On one occasion, we sat around the mosque courtyard and a Brelvi procession passed by the mosque chanting a naat, a devotional song in praise of Allah. Tablighis accused Brelvis of confusing music for worship. This reflected their tendency, also Brelvi tendency, conflate aspects of the world with the transcendental truth of religion. As the procession passed, Osman was visibly troubled, his head bowed and his lips moving in scriptural recitation. It was not long after this that he became afflicted with his bout of seriousness and becoming dried out. In these bouts, Osman would return to the ultimate source of Islamic authority, the Quran, to secure his faith, which was constantly entangled with aspects of life that he deemed beyond the parameters of appropriate religion. In other words, his seriousness was a concerted effort to purify the domain of religion from aspects of the world. So when he was doing his recitation, it was about disentangling these entangled worlds for himself. The stickiness of the world was a result of the conflicting ethical demands being made on him. On the one hand, he had to be a pious listener to God's word, mediated through the religious authorities of the Tablighi Jamaat. On the other hand, those same religious authorities placed ultimate value in a particular vision of an orderly, hierarchically structured home in which he was to listen assiduously to his parents. The disjuncture between parents and religious authorities, home and mosque, between Brelvi and Deobandi sects, manifest in him in a crisis of interiority, okay, or what I'm calling precarious faith. So let me just conclude a little bit here. I don't want to go on too long. Let me conclude with a few words about the significance of this account of the failure to realize piety. Dalal Asad's seminal critique that the category of religion presupposes a Christian and specifically Protestant model of religiosity has helped shift the focus in the study of religion away from belief and meaning to practice and materiality. Influential accounts of Islamic piety by Sabah Mahmud and Charles Erskine build on this claim, highlighting how practice is the basis for the cultivation of ethical sensibilities. In my own account, the ritualized practices of Dawat also create ethical sensibilities, but sustaining piety requires creating ethical relationships in the congregation, which is also explicit in Tablighi discourse. Tablighi say that piety comes from jor, connection, right? Which allows the Tablighi to stay and remain on the path of piety. Okay. The reason Tablighis emphasize companionship, sobat, is because they believe one is perpetually vulnerable to the evaluative stance of others. And it's only by subjecting oneself to the authority of the congregation of pious others that one can create, sustain, and grow the faith necessary to live a pious life. Despite Usman's zealous participation in the congregation, however, piety remained elusive to him. And this is because he experienced what Webb Keane has called, quote, the inner clash of ethical voices, a conflict between the voice of the pious others of the congregation and the voice of his kin, particularly his father. Recognizing piety as a relational form and an intersubjective achievement enables us to see the limits of individual agency and allows us to see how the religious domain is not autonomous, but entangled with other spheres of life like kinship, politics, and economics. Moreover, to truly understand the politics of piety, one must be able to see pious cultivation not only as self-making, but crucially also a world-making project. What one has to do is not just to remake the self, but in order to secure the self, one has to remake the entirety of one's relationships, and central to those, of course, are kinship. In this paper, we have seen that Tablighis aim to remake the world of kinship in terms of pious ideals, but the goal is to constitute all space in Islamic terms. This is because the pious self is perpetually vulnerable to other ethical possibilities, or what we can call the ethical otherwise. In a country like Pakistan, brimming with multiple religious, sectarian, and ethnic identities, creating a world under the single-voiced presence of God, which is the condition of certain faith, requires removing the possibility that one might be seduced by the voiced presence of others. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arsalan, and it was a really stimulating talk. And I think, a very powerful reminder of how important it is to pay attention to those manifold relationships that people entertain with others outside the most obvious religious arena. Our next speaker is Ammara Maqsood. Ammara, please. Ammara, you're still muted.
Yes, just 1 second. Let me just put on the video. I think there's something just wrong with my Zoom. Sorry, can you guys see me now?
Yes.
Sorry, my Zoom tends to get stuck. Thank you very much for inviting me to this, and thank you, Arsalan, for your talk. I think mine will juxtapose it quite well. So my paper is titled The Work of Time, Personhood, Agency, and the Negotiation of Religious Difference in Married Life in Urban Pakistan. It's a paper that doesn't talk about Islam directly, although Islam is everywhere in it. It's mostly about time and marriage and about trying to come to terms with marrying people who are different from you in terms of their religious aspirations. And in that sense, I think it overlaps a lot with what Arsalan's paper was about in different ways. But what I hope to do through this is to perhaps offer a perspective on how to talk about leading a pious life, particularly as it is entangled with other relationships and other commitments and other aspirations that people have. Recently, these topics have been subject of a debate that seems to have created these binaries between everyday Islam versus a more disciplined Salafi or disciplinary pious Islam. And I would just like to dislodge that kind of binary to say that when these different conflicts or different aspirations collide between, say, pious aspirations and, in my case, sort of private desires, it isn't always the case that there's fragmentation or that there's a conflict out of which there's no, or a conflict that's abrupt, that disrupts. But rather that these things can be quite continuous, and there are different ways in which these conflicts are managed. And I talk about time as one way in which they're talked about. And perhaps we can talk more about this in relation to the debates on everyday Islam versus a more disciplinary Islam that have come up in recent times. And I'll just read off my paper now. What is the work of time on a marriage, and how does it transform people as they struggle to change and leave traces on others? This question is at the heart of my fieldwork with young pious women in Lahore and Karachi who had initially been hesitant about marrying men who did not share their own religious aspirations. After some years, however, they found that the religious outlook of their spouses had shifted and that they had become more observant. Deploying conceptions of sabr, or forbearance, time was used both to mark and explain shifts in attitudes, as well as to speak of the contingencies that had shaped their married life and relationships. But just as time had worked on their husbands, it had also not left the women unchanged in their own religious aspirations, practices, and beliefs. Agency, understood here as the capacity to assert one's visions and hopes, depends on the malleability and openness of persons to time, leaving those who desire change in others equally exposed to transformation themselves. Drawing upon one life story from my larger ethnographic fieldwork among young married women from upwardly mobile backgrounds, my paper tries to bring together two central themes of my earlier and current research. First, I highlight here the open and processual quality of religious life in Pakistan, visible in individual life courses where people often move between different ideological positions. The same, I argue, can be said for relations across religious differences, which, for all their potential for conflict and violence, are, for the most part, ongoing and open-ended negotiations between people and families. And I think that Arsalan's story of Usman the cricketer and his family is perhaps one example of how this continues rather than disrupts. I center on marriage as one such intimate site where difference does not collapse, but becomes a means through which people relate to one another and evaluate their relationship. Second, and this is an aspect that is quite present in my paper, is the kind of non-liberal agency that emerges within these open-ended negotiations and in marriage. In a previous analysis of women orchestrating love-come-arranged marriages, I argued that success in marriage outcome often depends on upholding gendered norms of comportment, while skillfully navigating through kin and family structures to assert private desires. Building upon this, here I contend that agency in these contexts reveals itself neither as autonomous action, as they arise in the liberal tradition, but nor as willful submission as elaborated by Sabah Mahmood. The work of time, articulated through the concept of sabr, is a canvas for a confluence of human and non-human interventions, influences, and motivations, where people strive to make others just as they are making themselves and are being made by others. Samin was in her late 20s when we first met and had been married for 6 years with 2 small children. She had a graduate degree in economics but did not work, while her husband Heather was a policeman. When they had first got married, Samin had been ambivalent about the prospect, raised in a family that she herself called traditionally religious, in the sense that they were observant of most Islamic precepts, but not learned in such matters. Inspired by her aunt, who had become a Quran school teacher, Samin had started reading the Quran to understand our faith better and was keen to marry someone who shared her religious aspirations. But none of the suitors seemed suitable in this regard. She said, it was important for me that a person observed the rituals of Islam, so prayer, fasting, etc., and understood their meaning. Her parents, meanwhile, anxious not to delay her marriage, were putting considerable pressure on her to choose from the available proposals. Her aunt, reminding her that marriage pleases Allah, advised that rather than not marry at all, she should consider someone whose heart was open to his message. Ultimately, Samin accepted a proposal from Heather, who was not observant of the daily rituals, but as she described, had a good heart and was kind and open towards all. In other parts of the Muslim world, the prevalence of piety movements centered on women has led to an increased autonomy in marital decisions. But the case in Pakistan is ambivalent. There is a general rise in personal piety across genders, but one that is especially noticeable in women. So in the demographic, for instance, that I work in, almost all women have, at least at some point in their lives, attended dars, which is Quran study circles, while others have attended Quran schools. But while these women hope for a partner who matches their religious aspirations, other factors such as socioeconomic mobility, family obligations, or often lack of choices often take precedence. And I have rarely come across women who don't ultimately compromise. The overall emphasis on marriage points towards the centrality of the institution in individual and social life. Although almost all women are educated and often to the graduate level, they rarely work outside the house and are largely dependent on male affine. More broadly, within the upwardly mobile context that I work in, and in my book I've referred to that as the new middle class, there is immense dependence on family support and investment. Family support through joint family living and collective investment in business and property ventures is crucial for sustaining middle-class lifestyles of consumption. Marriage thus not only marks social adulthood, but is also a way of securing an economic future. And in this sense, it represents another form of becoming that opens up possible futures. And it both merges and conflicts with biased aspirations and desires for a more, what Navida Khan would say, a Muslim becoming. Time and destiny play an important role in how these tensions are mediated. The unknowability of destiny, Elite J. Elliott has argued, produces a labor of hope and anticipated actions to help realize the future. For my interlocutors, alongside a labor of hope, uncertainty is also a cause, and is also a cause of unease. And both these aspects are reflected in an ambivalence about the impact of the passage of time on a person. One day, Samin said to me, people assume that faith is standard, unchanging, but that is not the case. And true to her economic training, she drew me a graph. Look here, she said, labeling the vertical axis faith and the horizontal line time. This dot is you. Pointing towards the middle of the graph, she elaborated, you don't stay the same as time goes on. You either move up or down. Samin's graph reflects how time carries both possibilities for becoming and of a certain kind of unbecoming. While she believes that most of the responsibility of either outcome lies with an individual, her remark hints towards an acceptance, and reluctantly so, that not everything is within human control, as well as an openness to being acted upon by higher forces. In pious circles in Pakistan, irrespective of denominational leanings, there is a widespread belief that although it is incumbent on all to attempt closeness with Allah, only those who are destined for this connection will succeed. The sense that all is not in human control also plays into actions and fears. The sense that not all is in human control also plays into the actions and fears, is not limited to the religiously inclined, nor solely to matters of religiosity. And it is very much part of marital decisions in both love and arranged marriages. With the latter especially, people often argue that the course the union takes all depends on one's destiny, locally referred to kismet or nasib, and there thus is little point in getting to know someone now, and that it could just wait until after marriage. At the same time, such ideas open up possibilities of change. Samin may have had trepidations about how her own faith may lessen with time with an unobservant spouse, but she made her decision keeping in mind that time could transform an open heart. In this way, she, while fearing time's work on her, opened herself to the possibility of it changing others. Freedom, as Shrilke has written, is absent from the language of destiny. Here too, it is about making the best of limited choices, but it calls for both an acceptance of the inevitable and opens potentiality for future change. The labor of hope in these marriages involves the practice of sabr, a shadowing of time acting more like a stalker than a rebel. Commonly used in Urdu and Punjabi to mean patience, sabr is widely used in South Asia and in and out of Muslim contexts to talk of forbearance in the face of difficulty and suffering. Although there is a wider gendered expectation of all women demonstrating sabr in married life, for my pious interlocutors, the idea that one's spouse is predestined inflects marital difficulties as a test meted out by Allah. Sabr involves actively praying for change while quietly going about one's daily tasks and duties. Samin sometimes told Heather to start praying, but he would get annoyed, so she soon stopped asking him and instead went about her own prayers, hoping that it would eventually induce a change in him. This silence allowed for some kind of peace between them, but it also afforded her access to spaces of selected privacy in the household, parts of what Bourdieu would say the practical logic of kinship, to practice Islam in her own way. Samin's in-laws regularly held milad gatherings commemorating the Prophet that Samin personally considered to be bid'at or innovation, but she did not want to offend anyone by refusing to attend. Whenever there was a milad in the house, Samin would come up with an elaborate reason not to attend. For instance, her infant son was unwell or that she herself was ill. She reckoned that others probably knew what she was doing, but her mother-in-law would always accept her excuses and never said anything. Such forms of accommodating differences are possible only for they do not upset established hierarchies and authorities in the household. The quiet waiting of sabr opens up such spaces, but it does not end there. It is also underpinned by a hopeful expectation that their sabr will result in something. All the rewards of any act that pleases Allah can be meted out in this life or in hereafter. Much of the focus in Islamic discourses and discussions, especially in relation to suffering, is on the latter. And although no one denied that this world is of no significance compared to the one that awaits, the emphasis amongst young women is very much on life right now in this world. Sabr can soften even the heart of stone, said Samin, or witnessing the sabr of someone else can affect the other. It can create immense impact. Other interlocutors too would often talk of the unpredictable and surprising ways in which Allah could reward sabr. Waiting is marked by an anticipation, much like the uncertainty of return described by Bourdieu, even if the form, source, and timing of it remains unknown. The practice of sabr here emerges neither as active self-cultivation through submission, as Mahmoud has argued, nor as an autonomous agency of individual self-interest. To take a cue from Kaveri Qureshi, who deploys Mattingly's concept of moral laboratory, to argue that sabr is not simply about internal or interior efforts, but in play with something more external, more intersubjective, the world of social action. There are similar entanglements here between efforts directed toward the self and those directed outward. While the women in my ethnography practice sabr as it is virtuous, they also strive for transformation in and through others by their own self-making. Much to her disappointment, Samin's husband took little notice of the emphasis she placed on the daily rituals that in her eyes was an integral part of Muslim family life. 3 years ago, Heather, her husband, was posted to a small town while Samin and their 2 young children continued to live in joint family. Away from his young family, Heather began to realize that it is difficult to impart moral guidance to children without them following from example and watching others. My husband was always about the meaning behind things and did not give importance to the act of prayer, Samin said. But being away from us and with young children, he realized that all these abstract things mean nothing to kids. They get attached and exposed to religion through the ritual, she said. In order to have more influence in his children's life, he started to pray more regularly, especially in front of them. Samin said he started wanting to have more of a presence in their lives, that they should copy and follow him. So now he prays in front of them, so they watch and they do the same. For Samin, this change in her husband caused through the contingency of an out-of-city transfer presented itself as a fleeting opportunity to take up and assert one's own hopes and desires in a marriage. This is the work of time in married life courses. As Veena Das argues, time is not purely represented, but is an agent that works on relationships, allowing them to be interpreted, rewritten, scratched over as different social actors struggle to author stories. At the same time as women anticipate and hope that their self-cultivation elicits a response in and from human and non-human actors, they deny their own agency when it does occur. In describing this turn of events, Samin put herself at the center of the narrative and simultaneously not responsible, alternating between maybe this was his destiny, perhaps it was in my kismet that I'm rewarded for my sabr. Samin's explanations both acknowledge her efforts and efface them through an uncertainty on who acted on whom and because of what. Her own efforts become diffused with those of others. Was it her prayers and sabr that Allah answered, or had this always been predestined for Heather all along? I am mindful that this displacement of agency reflects the gendered limitations of asserting an autonomous self in a context where the dominant model of female virtue is of silence, suffering, and self-sacrifice. However, what I'm suggesting here is a form of self-making and personhood that is open to acting upon and being acted on by human and non-human divine others. In the larger waiting and anticipation for change induced through the actions of others, contingencies and external events take on special significance and are seized upon to impose one's own vision of truth and aspirations for the self. For my interlocutors, the work of time provides possibilities to carve out an individual and married future, rewriting and crossing older histories and weaving new narratives of self-making and of bringing change in others. Yet, being open to being acted upon by others leaves a person exposed to the work and designs of others over time. There is no space to delve into this here, and perhaps we can discuss this more in our discussion. But just as Heather had become more observant of Islam and its rituals, Samin has become less concerned with practice, an attitude she is sometimes rueful about, and does not have much time to devote to the daily study of Quran. Just as her histories and actions are written over Heather's trajectory, his actions have led to consequences and changes in her. Or was this what was predestined for her all along? Time, with its potential to reveal both the making and unmaking of persons, offers possibilities of change and transformation as women negotiate the limited choices that are available to them at the time of marriage. Marriage then represents a form of endless becoming, creating new possibilities of making oneself and others while introducing dangers of unbecoming. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ammara. I really loved the presentation, and I think that it also has significant areas of overlap with the Arsalan paper, and I'm quite glad that these areas emerged, because to be honest with everybody, there has been very little planning, about the event. I think also the paper underline how the household can become a site of ethical conflict and compromise over time. But also I was thinking perhaps the household is a site for ethical opportunities, and we're not ready to recognize that very often. Well, at least in the anthropology of Christianity. I don't know much about the anthropology of Islam, but we can talk about that. Our next speaker is David Henig. David.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes, David.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you, Diego. Well, if there has been a kind of synergy so far, so I will probably destroy it now, because I really like the two papers, and as Arsalan said, my work is about places that could be described in Arsalan's friend's words as corrupt Islam. I work in rural areas and kind of rural worship, one could say. But I do really appreciate the relational focus on piety. So I'll try to talk a little bit about that as well. I don't have a title of my talk because I will be talking mainly about my book. But if I did have a title, it would probably be something along the lines as Grace and Piety. So first of all, thank you, Diego, for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me. Really great papers. And the topic of our conversation today, Remaking Islamic Sociality and Piety, is an important one. But I must say that I struggled a bit with what I could say, given that the book that I published literally a month ago, or came out a month ago, deals exactly, or by and large, with the topic of remaking. It's called actually Remaking Muslim Lives. It's been hard to say anything new. So I would like to actually take this conversation that we have as an opportunity to reflect on some of the choices that I faced and had to make to actually approach the topic of remaking Islamic sociality in particular, and piety as well. And my work has been focused on how people remake their life worlds in the wake of dramatic societal ruptures, and about the role religious experience, and in particular Muslim religious experience, plays in shaping and making sense of these ruptures. As some of you might know, my work has been situated primarily in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in particular in rural areas, hence my reference to corrupt Islam. In turn, the book that I wrote about it revolves around the question of how Muslim lives and cultural values have been reconfigured and remade in the face of ruptures caused by political violence and economic dispossession ensuing from the violent disintegration of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1992 and its aftermaths. But the war in the 1990s was one of many other upheavals that village Muslims, with whom I've been working for nearly 15 years now, have had to come to terms with. So the the question I have been grappling with, and I would like to sort of share with you to think about it here, is how do, in my case, Muslims' entanglements in these kind of ruptures and of such magnitudes shape, fracture, and reconfigure religious conviction and conduct. And an answer to this question is, of course, context specific, but I hope that it might generate some discussion, in particular, about how to approach piety and sociality ethnographically then. So let's go back to my fieldwork for a minute. How villagers relate to Islam as a historically constituted body of knowledge and practice, and how they articulate their ways of being Muslim, has been shaped in my case, or case of my fieldwork, by the shifting forms of secular modernity aligned to state socialist power, by commitment to nationalism. As you know, nationalism was one of the main drivers of the war, by experiences of violence and political instability in the wake of the collapse of socialist Yugoslavia, but also increasingly, and especially during my fieldwork, by Bosnia's new geo-religious, as I call it, meaning in geopolitical sense, entanglements with the wider Muslim world. And I'm thinking in particular about the emergence and attempts to appropriate many kind of sites of piety and sociality in Bosnia by various, especially neo-Ottomanist projects coming from Turkey, that obviously have also consequences on the very materiality of religious experience, on ritual practice and so on. So this meant for me to attend to Islam and Muslim lives in the highlands where I've been working, as a nexus of everyday religious practice and experience with the divine, coupled with villagers' self-conceptions of what being Muslim means on the one hand. But on the other hand, I also had to track how this nexus unfolds in the flow of social life and is entangled in the histories of political and socioeconomic upheavals and transformations, increasing inequalities, as they are configured and reconfigured in the post-socialist and post-war present. And I must say that I did not find the kind of conventional approaches to the study of Islam that are rooted in the work of Talal Assad, which treat Islam as a coherent discursive tradition, but also some of the debates on piety as a subjectivity formation, particularly helpful for this context, where the ruptures really have been quite sort of significantly impacting also some of the conceptions and practices of piety. And the reason for this has been that in the context of multi-layered socio-political ruptures, such approaches are not very helpful. In rural Bosnia, the forms and practices of mediating Islamic religious tradition are often situated in villagers' material worlds, in their houses, fields, neighborhoods. That's where sociality and piety intersect. And these are not understood through some kind of devotional or doctrinal positions that arise solely from the scriptural discourse that predominate in revived Islamic piety movements that have emerged in, for example, in Sarajevo, in the capital, or in some cities after socialism. And what became a central theme and focus in regard to piety and sociality in my work is something what I would call as a kind of working sort of concept, an ethnographic theory of grace. And that's another maybe point that we could discuss later. How would our debates on piety look like if we approach them from the perspective of grace? Grace is kind of an interesting concept. I'm thinking of Julian Pitt Rivers' work, for example, that can sort of shed light on some interesting sort of debates. Anyway, so just to repeat again my sentence, and what became a central theme and focus in regard to piety and sociality is an ethnographic theory of grace that being embedded quite literally in villages' material world has been quite robust to, as a kind of piety that basically has been embedded in villages' material world and quite robust to endure the above mentioned ruptures. At the same time, grace is a helpful concept for addressing or opening some new kind of perspectives on piety. And here I'm thinking about the work on by Cecil Barrow and his collaborators, who, for example, wrote about divine grace, that it's a gratuitous gift bestowed inexplicably, not as a reward for exemplary acts of piety. So what is it? And that's something I try to grapple a little bit with in my book. And in my book, I'm developing something what I call, as I said, ethnographic theory of grace, which I call or describe vital exchange as one way of sort of approaching this intersection of piety and sociality. And to elaborate what I mean by vital exchange, I will read just a bit from the book, because I think I'll give you one example and few thoughts on this from the book. So let me start with the vignette. One hot afternoon, I found myself helping my next door neighbor Fadil and his family. Worried about the gloomy clouds clustering on the horizon, we worked hurriedly and tirelessly for several hours, making a haystack that would preserve high quality hay for the winter months. After everyone had finished, we all sat down and rested against the haystack we had just made. A few minutes later, Fadil pulled a few dried stalks of grass from the haystack and silently held them for a while. Then he turned to his grandson while still holding the stalks in his hands and said, "This is milk, thanks to Allah." Fadil's expression was subtle, evocative, and pregnant with meaning. It entwined the cosmological and the material. With God's blessing, secured through prayers for rain performed before the haymaking season, throughout the year, hay is fed to livestock, which in turn provide milk, meat, and manure to regenerate the soil. All are vital substances that sustain the members of the household. Their abundance is manifestation of God's grace in the course of everyday life. But milk and meat can also be turned into much needed cash by selling dairy products and thus improving household budgets in situations of economic marginalization. The expression, "This is milk, thanks to Allah," entwines material resources and social reproduction with Muslims' religious sensibilities. By telling, showing, and instructing his grandson in front of other family members, Fadil embraced in a single sentence the intergenerational relationship of care between the house as a compound of people, the land, animals, and social practices of reproduction of life as an unfolding exchange with the divine. And I think kinship comes here as well in kind of interesting way with the other papers. "This is milk, thanks to Allah," was an expressive trope articulating how the house becomes a site of exchange with God, underpinned by everyday historical work, which is another concept I develop in the book. Through caring for the land, Fadil and his family secured the house enduring strength and divine blessing, or barakah, which sustained the household over time. The story of Fadil captures the central argument I make in this book, as it shows the other kinds of relations at work in expressing what it means to be Muslim in the flow of everyday life. In what follows, I argue that living a Muslim life in rural Bosnia is ordered by deep relations of obligation and care among the living, the dead, and the divine that are generations deep. These relations are governed by notions of exchange and reciprocity. Religious conceptions of what it means to be Muslim and live a Muslim life are ultimately oriented towards the quest for salvation in the afterlife, so the kind of future horizon that we just heard about, a pursuit that influences their actions in the world here and now. This moral horizon is defined by the fundamental question, how to live. Pathways oriented towards the afterlife are multiple and uncertain, but they are all generated by human activities, which ultimately determine religious relationship with the divine over time. The expressions permeating everyday village life, such as "only Allah knows," "if God permits," or "God is merciful," are inseparable from daily acts of help and care. They are woven into the vast web of interpersonal relations. Everyday historical work, how people relate to the past, the present, and the future, in other words, is consistent with religious apprehension that human activities have consequences for one's life, trajectory, and the afterlife. Everyday life, in other words, is where values are generated and religious experience is articulated. This historically unfolding interactional relationship with the divine, as mediated through human actions and the cultivation of interpersonal relations and exchanges with fellow villagers and by caring for the souls of the dead, is deeply ethical. For villagers, human activities and commitments in the world here and now are literally vital for whatever pathway to salvation one may forge. To grasp this generative and creative force of human activities across a vast array of relationships, all domains of social life, and through time, this book explores how villagers construe what it means to be a Muslim life and live to be Muslim and live a Muslim life as a flow of vital exchange with God. So, in a nutshell, vital exchange refers to a moral horizon of action and to the means by which villagers bring a perpetual flow of divine grace, abundance, and prosperity in their everyday lives. Viewed from this perspective, living a Muslim life consists not so much of claiming a specific ethno-national identity, as became very important in the war and post-war context, but of taking part in day-to-day exchanges of blessing, barakah, prosperity, nafaka, and fortune, hire, in good deeds and merits, sawab or thawab in Arabic, and in prayers, between the living, the dead, and the divine. Such notions as blessing, fortune, luck, destiny, and salvation, as Samuel Schielke writes, don't always figure in the analytical toolbox of social scientists, yet their analytical purchase in uncertain world is far-reaching. And since divine grace, as I already said, Cecile Barrault argues, is a gratuitous gift bestowed inexplicably, not as a reward for exemplary acts of piety, this book traces the manifold instances and side of vital exchange with God in everyday life, which are irreducible to the realms of Islamic orthodoxy and scriptural reasoning, just as they escape ethno-national categorization. So I will finish here. But basically, what I try to show in this sort of short vignette is how the concept of grace can be quite sort of productive, I hope, for thinking about piety and sociality. So I'll finish here, Diego.